Hopefully you're going to remember something from this video. But how will your brain store that information? Exactly how does the brain learn? If we look at brain tissue under a microscope, we see that it's made up of cells called neurons, cells that are dedicated to processing information. We have about 86 billion of these neurons in our brain, and each neuron communicates with those around it by firing electrical signals. A neuron can link up with other neurons by making a connection called a synapse, across which information passes to the other neuron. Each neuron has several thousand connections with other neurons, resulting in massive complex networks that can store and process information. Information, including educational knowledge and understanding, is actually stored in these synapses between neurons in our brain. It is these connections that lead to every concept in our mind having its own unique pattern of neuron activation. Imagine you have never heard of a square root before. If I say the word root, that will probably bring to mind the concept of a root, prompting a unique pattern of activation in your neural networks that represents or codes for this concept of a root. If I say the word square, that will bring to your mind the concept of a square, generating another pattern of neural activation that uniquely represents or codes for this concept. Coming across both of these ideas together in the phrase square root activates both patterns simultaneously, and then something very important for learning occurs. After hearing this phrase enough times, we see a strengthening of connections between the two patterns for square and root, and even new connections forming that link them. Now, the idea of square also activates the idea of root. And if you encounter the concept root, it's quite likely that you'll activate the neural pattern for square as well, bringing that to mind too. You've learnt to associate and connect these ideas together. Your brain has acquired the knowledge that there is something called a square root. Of course, in education, we think about learning as coming about through interaction between the student and the teacher, from students talking to each other, from accessing the internet, from reading a book. But actually, all forms of learning rely ultimately on our neural networks being able to change their connections or synapses. The ability of the brain to change is called plasticity, and the ability for it to change its connections is called synaptoplasticity.